So, as you said, my name's Charlotte Conn. I'm 26 years old and I'm from the better half of England, which is the north, obviously. And I'd like to start my section of the conference today with a story. Before I begin, I just want to reassure those with lived experience of HD that it's okay if this story is difficult to listen to. If we were meeting in person, I wouldn't be offended if some of you had to take time for yourself or come back to listen later. Please be kind to yourself. So this is a tale of tenacity. Once upon a time, in a land not too far away, lived a girl named Betty. She lived with her mum, dad, sister, and grandmother. Betty was an ordinary girl living an extraordinary life. Our story starts with Betty as a young girl finding her feet in a big world. Betty's grandmother, Lynn, was always on hand to support her through everything, picking her up from school, taking her to ballet class, and watching the same dance routine at least 5 times a night. Lynn was a special grandmother, a fairy grandmother, in fact, and she had magical powers and could just about make any worry disappear. But just like any fairy tale, this tale includes an enemy. Its mission to see her fairy grandmother blunder and fail. Initially, Lynn knew of the enemy and was trying to close in, but hid it from Betty every day. The enemy began to take over Lynn. It found home in her body, and at the start of the battle, it changed the way she walked and how she thought. Betty, being a young girl, started to realize her nan was changing, but loved her all the same. As Betty got older, she started to ask lots of questions as to why her fairy grandmother was losing her spark. Why must her magic fade? She asked her mum, Leah. Her mum had also inherited Lynn's magical fixing powers, which unfortunately meant she knew of the enemy too. They had seen its path before, so decided it was best to tell Betty that they were fighting a silent battle, one that was to grow to be life-changing. They explained the enemies went by the name of the Hidden Destroyer, or HD, and it had taken others but had never been fully defeated. Little did Betty know it was to consume Lynn's whole body, mind, and soul, making her a shell of her former self. Betty was devastated, confused, and aggrieved by the news. Worse still, Leah explained the enemy lay dormant in her too, and was battling the enemy in her mind every day. The enemy made Betty's mum sad, anxious, and sometimes aggressive. The twists in this tale don't end there. The enemy was so complex and conniving that there was a possibility it found its way into Betty and her sister's lives. As months went by, Betty started to understand what this meant for her and her family. This particular enemy, she found out, was called HD, could have been passed down from birth. Not all was lost, though. There was a tribe of people supporting the fight against the enemy. The army of people was made up of the HD community, researchers, and medical professionals. Betty learned that there was plenty of people on their side, despite the seemingly enormous struggle ahead. As she grew into a young adult, Betty's curiosity about the enemy grew every day, and she contacted a local tribe member, her GP, to refer her to a genetic counsellor. She had the chance to speak to somebody for the first time who understood the mental torture she was quietly going through. They spoke about the past, the present, and the future, and how and when Betty might like to know if she too would live with the enemy. What would you do if your life presented you with an opportunity to know what your future held? Betty asked her friend one day, who was completely oblivious to everything going on. She replied, "Well, I wouldn't want to know if anything bad was going to happen. I might not want to carry on." Betty pondered. Mirror, mirror on the wall, will HD consume me at all? Betty started to realize the strange phenomenon of what it meant, just what it meant to carry the enemy. She often dissociated herself from the family's battle. The burden she carried did not feel like her own, and if she thought too much about it, it felt like a strange nightmare that she could never wake up from. Life had to carry on, and Betty instinctively stepped up to care for her fairy grandmother, ensuring her magic was felt in a different way. She had big dreams of her own and wanted to conquer the world, but unlike her friends, every choice that she made, she had to consider the enemy and her loved one. How will this choice impact their battle? Will they need me? She considered going to university to flourish, grow, and learn, but as with everything, discussed this with her grandmother to make sure she wasn't too far away for those harder days and the care involved keeping an enemy like HD at bay. The hidden destroyer caused havoc with Lynn's body, limiting her ability to walk, talk, eat, and do things she once enjoyed. Betty still felt her magic and kindness with the actions she could show, with warm hugs and a listening ear. They saw each other all the time, with Betty learning everything it took to take a stance against HD. She learned to cook and clean, patience and grounding to ensure her approach to battle was always gentle and understanding. Although not everybody in Betty's world could see the enemy, HD was invisible in its true form to many and often disguised itself as drunk in public places, shape-shifting Lynn into a completely different being. Betty and Lynn were often challenged when doing things you often take for granted, shopping for food or sitting in a coffee shop. Betty learned she had to be patient with these people. They didn't understand and they couldn't see the real enemy. She took it upon herself to educate those who maybe showed a little ignorance to the situation. Awareness of the enemy became important to her. The enemy became too strong for Betty to fight, so she recruited the help of a castle called Castle Nursing Home. They would support Lynn with retaining her powers, fighting the enemy, and of course keeping her comfortable. Over the course of her battle, there were many interventions put in place, one being a peg feeding system that ultimately kept Lynn alive. HD made eating and drinking impossible for Lynn, and the tribe of medical professionals deemed it necessary to intervene. Betty's role continued alongside her newfound friends in the castle, although it took a lot of trial and error to get the right castle for Lynn's magic to remain. There were individuals that caused a lot of upset and devastation, not running castles how you would expect and making the fight almost unbearable at times. Eventually, the family found a home where Lynn was happy. Unfortunately, Betty could not foresee the enemies that were waiting. March 2020 came, and an evil pandemic swept the world. Castle gates came down, and the walls were built high. All of those inside trapped with no way out until the authorities had a plan to tackle things. Months went by, and Betty hadn't seen Lynn. This was unprecedented. They didn't go days apart, never mind months. She did visit once, but unfortunately visited from outside beyond the gates. Lynn didn't understand why Betty and Leah couldn't come in. She'd shed stones in weight, losing the only reason she had to keep battling had crushed her world. She screamed and cried, abusing castle staff who supported her in a wheelchair in pure frustration. Without her voice, Lynn survived and loved by touch and her family. She was without both, with the world's fear of infection. Seeing somebody she loved with every ounce of her being in such distress, with no control, was too much to bear. Betty knew she had to get in the castle somehow, so applied for a job to support the castle staff in their care role for Lynn and all the other fairy grandparents. She was successful. What a joy. She could finally see her Lynn again. In Betty's absence, the enemy had caused mass destruction. Lynn was tormented by the demons that possessed her, and Betty worked tirelessly day and night to bring equilibrium back to Lynn's magic. There was a shortage of medical attention and an error in Lynn's potions, which caused trauma and pain for the family. Lynn was aggressive and violent, causing injury like she'd never before. Fear not. Betty had a sixth sense and a special vision, and she could see the magic through the enemy, despite how difficult others found Lynn being in Lynn's presence. Betty wasn't fazed. She had experience of this battle and would be there until the end. Working on a weekend, Betty spent the lunch break of her 12-hour shifts laying with Lynn, putting the world to rights. Lynn's magic was no longer ignited by external sources like televisions or activities, and she became stressed and agitated at most noise or change to routine. She was happiest and most comfortable in bed, so in the end, staff and family let her be. Laying under the white Artex ceiling on a bed surrounded by mats to protect Lynn from her movements, Betty would explain all that was going on outside the castle, updating her on her life, friends, and Lynn's favourite celebrities. There was such beauty in the simplicity of such quality time, but often Betty found herself holding back the tears during their conversations. that to the outside world it looked like she was talking to herself, with Lynn unable to verbally respond. It was often a reminder of everything she'd lost. Lynn would hold her tight best she could until it was time for Betty to go back to work in her full PPE. Betty and Leah had to get good at communicating with people from different tribes. The enemy had taken away Lynn's freedom, and she was locked away from the beautiful world outside. Occupational therapists looked at Lynn's simple day, castle staff with minimal knowledge of the disease, sometimes in tears at how the enemy had left Lynn in misery. Consultants over Zoom and on the phone, social workers who assessed Lynn's battle as if it ever got better or a cure had miraculously been found, but still had to decide if she needed all the support she received. It was constant, all while Betty was slowly losing the woman she knew as her mum, watching her grieve for her own mum, anticipating her own future. Betty's mum fought hard, a small family, and Leah an only child. They were the best of friends through every storm. Eventually, the enemies were too strong for Lynn's body, taking her away from Earth and her family. Betty's life as she knew it was over, and she had to rebuild herself at just 25 years old. What was her life without thinking about everything to do with Lynn's care? What was she to do now? Although the sad part in this story is, Mirror, Mirror knows that it's all to come again with her lovely mum. Betty got fed up with feeling powerless and decided it was time for change. There had to be more she could do. She shared her story for the first time with family and friends to raise funds for a magical group of people called the HDYO, and that's where Betty found her own magic. She used her story to help others, spreading awareness far and wide about the enemy and what we could do to support those with it. She went on to a job in the National Health Service to use her experiences to help others impacted by enemies such as mental health. With more confidence and less fear for her own future, and a newfound army of individuals with the same mission, Betty decided it was a good time to understand her own fate. She was in a good place with lots of special magic people in her life supporting her. It took her 7 years to decide whether to reveal the hidden destroyer's plans. She prayed on her nan's magic every night, not for her sake, but for her mum's, and she knew if she carried the enemy, it would shatter her mum's heart into a million pieces. Betty didn't share her journey of testing until the day of finding out her result. The 1st of March 2023, the day that would change her life forever. Betty woke up with a spring in her step a few weeks after returning from an adventure of a lifetime climbing Kilimanjaro. She felt at peace, assured that she'd made the right decision. She knew she was ready to know and recorded her last video diary entry before receiving her results. She went with her knight in shining armour, her partner, walked to the first floor of the waiting room and sat on the chairs. Her counsellor came out and they walked together down what seemed the longest corridor she'd ever seen, despite walking it numerous times before. It's bad news, the counsellor said, so quick Betty had even barely sat down. She'd told her about this before, about how they don't make small talk with people who are frantically waiting. Betty cried, but not a sob. A few seconds passed. She said, I'm not heartbroken for me, I'm heartbroken for my mum. A million thoughts whizzed through her mind as the noise of the conversation in the room was drowned out. She'd imagined this day most of her life, played it out in her head, and it wasn't anything like she envisaged. The crying only lasted for a few seconds, and she told the counsellor, I'm okay. This is what's supposed to happen in my life, and I'm going to use this to inspire everything that I do. The counsellor was taken aback. Betty, this is a big thing to process, and you don't have to be okay. Betty knew that, but being a carer, she was so used to putting on a brave face and being practical, it often took a while for difficult things to sink in. This was no exception. They continued their conversation. Then the counsellor paused her sentence, put a warm, reassuring hand on her shoulder and said, if anybody can get through this, I know you can. Betty and her partner walked out. They sat in the car. She was lost, unsure of what to say or what to do. In her mind, she took herself back to how her mum must have felt all those years before, receiving a positive HD result for the enemy with 2 small children who doted on her. Betty had been raised by 2 of the strongest women the world had ever seen, and Betty compared every hardship in life to the hardship Lynn went through. If she could get through all she did, then Betty could get through this. She asked her partner to drive to her parents, and she had not shared the testing. She had shared the testing process with her dad, but not her mum. 6 weeks of waiting for a result would have been too much for her. She pulled up to the house, her dad preparing her for what was to come. Leah opened the door. Betty said, "I'm sorry, Mum." Leah screamed. She shouted, "No, please, no." She knew that she had to be strong for her mum, and she comforted her sorrow. This is not your fault," she repeated until she calmed down. Her dad tried his best to be strong, but burst into tears. He had always denied this being a possibility. Betty decided to share her news online with friends and family later that week. A few weeks had passed, and it was as if Betty was witnessing people grieving her own death. Hundreds of messages, flowers, gifts, and cards to the house. Tears from loved ones in a period of busyness, followed by a quiet lull where she had to sit with the news on her own. HD was a huge ball in a box with a pain button on one side, a ball so big that you couldn't think or see anything else, and it didn't stop hitting the button. As time went by, Betty learnt more and more magic and saw the beauty in small things like beautiful sunsets, pretty flowers on a sunny day, or appreciating the moment when your favourite song comes on the radio. The ball in the box came smaller and smaller as she grew in positivity, but that wasn't to say that when the ball hit the pain button, it wasn't as intense, because it was, but the intensity just didn't last as long anymore. It was worse on birthdays or anniversaries, when she ate her grandmother's favourite chocolate or noticed a new symptom in the enemy of her mum. It was a constant journey, a constant battle, but one much harder alone than with an army of people who wanted her to win. On days where the pain felt excruciating, she reminded herself that even if her future wasn't what she hoped, if she stopped fighting, then the enemy would win. She lived in a world where war was ever prevalent and heartbreakingly destructive, but this war was different. Nobody was on HD's side. Even if she didn't see the war won, her suffering would never be in vain, and her tiny part in the fight would always be important for that reason, and she encouraged people to fight with her. Betty lived happily ever after, some days, but not all, because that's life. If you hadn't already guessed it, that was a story about my HD journey. I am represented in the story as Betty. Betty was my great nana who also had the disease. I was 11 when my family first told me about the disease, but they had known of the disease since I was 5. I worked in my nana's care home as a care assistant on a weekend, and I also worked for the NHS Trust who deliver my mum's specialist neurological care. Maybe there's parts of the story that you can pick out and relate to, or maybe there's parts that made you apprehensive about what's to come in your own life. Or maybe it helped you understand of what it's like to experience HD. An integral part of my story was shaped during the depths of COVID-19 pandemic, and I was trying to think of something to signify this. I found a picture of this whiteboard from my nan's room. At the start of the pandemic, she weighed just 48.1 kilos, and that's 7.5 stone, which was already small. When I went into the care home and started my first shift, her weight was just 6.1 stone. My nan was without the physical connection from her family, and the distress of such change made her condition devastatingly worse. I think this signifies the importance of the reason that somebody with HD keeps going, and I think it's so important that we understand that. And in my opinion, I think that's what's missing in HD care at the moment. I was told I live with the faulty gene 9 months ago, and the concept of finding out if you carry a disease that you can't see yet is a strange phenomenon. I went back and forth with my counsellor for 7 years from the age of 18 and often put off testing because I was worried about the impact that it would have on others around me. My nan was too poorly, or mum wasn't in the best place, or I felt it would put too much pressure on my sister. Deep down, I always knew I would be positive. So in a way, that's why I think I didn't get upset. Maybe I'd already started to process it for all that time. I live with my partner, and when I found out about the result, despite being open with him since the start of our relationship 6 years ago, I really doubted my self-worth. I told him it was okay if he wanted to leave. He'd seen my nan for years of her struggle and stayed with the two of us through hours of her distressed episodes, and I didn't want him to see me like that. He reassured me, and 1 month later, on the trip we planned to take my mind off things, this happened. We were engaged. He taught me that love comes in many forms, and if you, like me, question your self-worth because of HD, we deserve love and happiness, and there are people who want to give us it. Dealing with my result hasn't been easy, and there's been lots of tears, time off work, confusing moments, and I've used coping strategies such as keeping fit, which has helped lots with fundraising. I also set up a social media page, which has been very cathartic for me to share my experiences. I get messages from people all over the world sharing their incredible stories with me too. Many of them have never told people of HD before without realizing they're sharing with me with such strength. I understand people experience HD in such different ways. Some have seen family unwell with it for years. Some have carried the gene but have never met their families. Many are only just finding out about it, or some are yet to even find out about it. One of the lovely ladies I've connected with from America shared this quote with me after we had chatted for a few weeks. It hadn't clicked with me either, even though others were adding so much to my life. It was the other way around too. It reads, one day you'll tell your story of how you've overcome whatever you're going through now, and your story will become part of someone's survival guide. Even my mum's and nan's stories were so vastly different. My nan never even spoke the word Huntington's to me. Her generation didn't speak about their health, but my goodness, I wish she'd had support like this. My mum's disease was completely different and mostly mental and cognitive until a few years ago. And I think it's really important that we don't generalize patients with HD's experiences. I'm really glad that I can be open with HD about HD to my family, but it hasn't always been that way, and I understand that it's a difficult topic for a lot of families. I'm not here to tell you that's wrong. It's not. Whatever works for you is amazing. And I'm also not naive in knowing that a lot of the time I give to advocacy now, I couldn't have given when my nan was actively very unwell. It would be really wrong of me to share my experiences of HD without touching on the topic of grief. I like to think of myself as a positive person, but HD is a conveyor belt of grief that never breaks. A lot of people in the world have grieved the loss of a loved one, physical loss of a loved one, but a lot of people impacted by this awful condition grieve for years before that. Somehow, as humans, we convince ourselves that this type of grief isn't a comparable pain to physical loss, but if I base it on my experience alone, it most certainly is. Until I tested positive, I had never understood the concept of grieving my own life. A small part of myself imagined growing old and having a big family, but everything changed when I received my result. As the story explained, in January this year, I got the opportunity of a lifetime to climb the highest peak in Africa, Kilimanjaro. I only found out about it in November last year when I was, and it came about in a strange way. I've shared my advocacy work on social media platforms, and my dad's organisation were running a rare disease awareness campaign. They agreed that I would be a great person to go on the trip. I started fundraising straight away for the HDA, and in January of this year, I flew halfway across the world on my own and met 10 strangers from all over the world, all with one mission: to raise awareness for rare diseases and to climb Kilimanjaro. I shared my story with my campmates in a dark tent lit by a solar-powered torch and explained that I'd been for my genetic test result a week before setting off and would find out my fate when I got home. There was a point when climbing the day of the summit push when I stood on the mountainside and looked out onto the incredible view. I burst into tears. I realised this was so much more than reaching the top. My nan and mum lived in Africa for over a decade, and for some reason I felt I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was proving to myself I could do absolutely anything I put my mind to whilst I had my health, and no matter the outcome of my result, that was what I was going to continue to do. In the airport on the way to Africa, I was wandering around a bookshop, waiting for my flight. I noticed Michelle Obama's new book, one copy with the blurb facing upwards. It read, "I've learned it's okay to recognize that self-worth comes wrapped in vulnerability, and that what we share as humans on this earth is the impulse to strive for better. Always and no matter what. We become bolder in brightness, and if you know your light, you know yourself. You know your own story in an honest way. And in my experience, this type of self-will builds confidence, which in breed builds calmness and the ability to maintain perspective, which finally to being able to connect meaningfully with others. And this to me is the bedrock of all things. One light feeds another, one strong family lends strength to one more, one engaged community can ignite those around it. This is the power of the light we carry. I was really inspired by this quote and took a photo of the book, sending it to our family group chat. As I had the epiphany moment on the mountainside, I remembered this quote and realised I didn't have to be okay all the time. And in fact, my struggles were what had got me to that point. Being vulnerable about my journey has made me countless friendships and improved my life tenfold. Nobody had cured HD, brought back my nan, made my mum well, or taken away my gene positive result, but I had accepted that I could use my pain to help others, to help myself, and to guide my own healing. I couldn't control what life threw at me, although I wish it would just calm down with the shots, but I could control how I rebuilt it and rose above the moments that turned my world upside down. Friends often ask how I cope, and I always refer back to my nan and her laughter. That lady was nil by mouth, bedbound, and couldn't talk, and she still made me belly laugh and belly laughed at me, which, by the way, wasn't good for my anxiety around her choking episodes. I know when times get tough, there will be more moments of laughter and pure joy waiting, even if they're small and fleeting. Sharing my story hasn't always been comfortable for me, and I want to reassure you if you're in a place where sharing like this doesn't feel right, that's okay. Sharing my story once looked like plucking up the courage to tell my best friend my nan and mum were poorly, but not what with, telling my teacher the real reason I was late for class, or telling my GP the reason for my referral at 18. It then became advocating in small ways, like explaining to my nan's favourite coffee shop owner that she needed a little less coffee in her cup to ensure the courier didn't see it all over her. Advising utility companies my nan couldn't talk on the phone because of her slurred speech. It's still those little moments, and sometimes, let me tell you, those are harder than situations like this. Start small and stay small if you want, but please know you don't have to do this alone. You see, Huntington's disease isn't my story. It's just part of it. I don't get to choose the ending. But I get to shape the journey, the experiences I have along the way, and the attitude I carry myself with, and the people I inspire. The Michelle Obama quote that I shared epitomizes everything we strive for as a community. Whether you're a professional working with those with HD, impacted by HD, or in another capacity, we are one light feeding another, one strong family lending strength to one more, and we are a community igniting those around us. We are powerful together, and we can change the future of HD. When you share your story, a domino effect starts. A new perspective gets out there and it allows a new voice to be heard until the whole world looks different. It doesn't have to be bold or loud, but lots of small movements can have a profound impact. So let me leave you with this question. What's the power of sharing your story? Thank you very much.